Welcome to our next segment of the HDR Masterclass. In this segment, I'm going to be going through a number of examples where I think you're going to be able to appreciate the difference that you'll in photography that you'll get from a single framed capture versus an HDR processed image. So without going into too much detail, let's start looking at some of these examples here. This is a hotel, very wonderful, and this particular room that you see here on the right, I'm sorry, on the left, is that is a single frame exposure that I was able to take in this room. This room had a very bright sun on the outside that was pouring in on this large window, and you'll notice here that the single frame photo was actually metering pretty heavily on all of this intense light coming in through the window. And what that did, because the camera, this is a single image now, a single frame image. So what happened is that the camera's metering was exposing for the highlights in the scene, and therefore tended to make the darks be underexposed. So essentially what I have here is an overexposed area, and I have an underexposed area, underexposed there as well. So what's happening here is a term that is called clipping. And in this particular case, because the dynamic range of the camera isn't capable of exposing the very high levels of light, I have clipping that's occurring in the highlight areas of the image, and I have clipping that's occurring in the shadow areas of the image. Now, really, clipping simply means that the camera is not able to digitize those particular pixels, all right? Or to be a little bit more technically accurate, the camera is not able to assign a numeric value within the range of 0 to 128 for the pixels that are clipped. So, clipping here on the shadow side tends to mean that a clipping would mean that there is no numeric value that the camera can assign to those blacks. And clipping on the highlight side means that the camera is not able to assign a numeric value above 128, which would be pure white. So this is what we mean by clipping. It simply means that the camera was unable to assign a numeric value to the pixels based upon their tonal value, which ranges from black all the way through white. But no worries, we're going to be talking about that more. But the point of these examples is to help you more fully understand the limitations of a single frame capture for most consumer level cameras. Now, taking a look at this next example over here on the right, I got it right this time. This is an HDR processed image. Now, you'll notice here what primarily the whole point and the purpose of HDR is to be able to distribute the exposure values nice and evenly all through the scene. So we don't have a clipping scenario in the window as we did on the left side, and we also don't have clipping issues in the darker areas. Basically, it's an evenly exposed final image, and that's the whole point of HDR. Let's take a look at another example. This is Fairchild Garden in Florida. Absolutely beautiful and stunning place to be, and bright skies, lots and lots and lots of sun, and also the palm trees tend to have very heavy, thick leaves, and they cast some very significant shadows. So here I am. Here's a single exposure, a single frame exposure. All right, and what I'm getting here, I'm getting the sky is blown out, what they call it, basically overexposed. And I'm also getting a lot of dark areas that are underexposed. So again, the term clipping is occurring. The sun is so bright in certain areas here that it's actually clipping. Now, clipping again is the camera is unable to assign a numeric value, and therefore there is no image information. It's either all white or all black. This is the HDR processed image. Nice and even exposure all the way through. There is a much better retention of detail, which is also one of the objectives of HDR photography. And the leaves and the palm trees and the water are all just beautifully exposed and making an absolutely gorgeous image. Let's talk about another example. Now this is an indoor shot. This is at Mystic Seaport in Mystic, Connecticut. It's essentially a very old shipyard and port, and dating way back to the early 1700s. But there's a lot of buildings here, and inside these buildings there are very large windows, probably because they needed all the windows that they could get. That was before the days of electricity. And so they wanted their rooms to be, their interior rooms to be flooded with light. So here's an image, and this is a single frame image. And you'll notice here that there's an awful lot of darks and shadow areas, primarily because the camera is metering on the intense light coming in through the window. And I wanted the window in my picture. So it's not like I had a choice where I could move the camera in such a way that the window was no longer in the frame. I wanted the window there. But what happened was the camera was unable to meter so that I had a good balance between the highlights and the darks or the shadows. So here is the HDR image capture, and nice and even distribution of the tonal qualities. Very good balanced exposure, and probably more important, you'll notice here that the window is not causing the exposure to be overexposed. And therefore, since I'm handling the exposure, I am not driving other segments of my image into an underexposed situation. Now let's look at another one. This is the Grand Canyon. And the single frame exposure here on the left, you'll notice here that I have a sky which is lost tonal value. It was a beautiful blue sky, but here I'm gray. Colors are muted. I've lost detail. But you'll notice something here. I'm not necessarily trying to deal with the highlights and the shadows. This is not so much of an exposure or a dynamic range situation as it is trying to recover tonal values, trying to be able to capture the vibrant colors that I as a human being saw, and also trying to recover or retain detail. So HDR photography goes beyond exposure compensation. On the right, this is my HDR processed image. Details have come back out. The sky was returned to blue. The overall exposure is much nicer, much more even. The colors are much more satisfactory. It's very difficult to see when you're looking at a relatively tiny image here in this video, but this image of the Grand Canyon as an HDR processed image is just absolutely stunning. Beautiful. Not something I could have obtained or come home with had I gone to the Grand Canyon with just my camera and no additional photography methodology. So let's take a look at another one. It's very simple. I mean, this is just a top-down photo of a plant in my backyard, but I'm showing it here to illustrate that I have a loss of detail. The darks, the shadows have been basically underexposed. Can't see the detail. The midtones are kind of soft. And but as an HDR exposed or processed image, the details come back out. You can see here, you can see down into the lower level leaves. Remarkable. They were all lost in shadow. I mean, look at this. All right, it brings out detail. It just evens out the exposure so that there's more that can be seen. And taking a look at our final example for this particular segment, here I have three exposure bracket. Here's the first one, and this is at what they call 0 EV. That is basically the camera with no exposure compensation set. That's what the camera sees. And then here is -1 EV. That's one stop below the 0. All right, and then here we have one stop above. And so I have a series of 3 captures for this particular scenario, and the result is an HDR processed image that gives me a much better tonal range, much better exposure all the way through the scene. The highlights are controlled. They're not overblown. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at this histogram right in here, right there, you'll see, and I'm going to talk about histogram, a very important aspect of understanding what your camera is seeing in terms of light levels. I'm not having any clipping on the highlight side, and I'm not having any clipping on the shadow side. And that is ideally where we want to be with our images. So that's enough for examples for right now. There's going to be more that we'll be taking a look at as we move along. But this is a series of single frame captures versus the HDR processed images. And I think this helps give you a better appreciation for maybe not how we go about HDR, that's coming, but why we go about utilizing HDR. And these examples give you a pretty good appreciation for what you can do with HDR photography. We're going to introduce more examples throughout the course, but the examples that I've presented give you a pretty good idea what the benefit of HDR is in terms of the difference between a single frame capture and an HDR processed image. In the next segment, I'm going to define what HDR is in more depth. We're going to talk about what the problem is that we're trying to address with HDR. I'll define high dynamic range, and we'll give ourselves some preparation when we move into the next segment after that, where we talk about fundamentals. and we are coming to a point where we're going to be able to talk about field capture for purposes of HDR photography. So please join me in the next segment, HDR Defined, and I'll see you there.